Not that long ago, I did a video on this right here, the OBSBOT Tiny 2, which is one of the best 4K webcams on the market at the time of recording this video and my previous video. And if you want to check out that previous video, I'll have a link to it right here at the top of the screen. But it was a great video talking about in depth how good the Tiny 2 really is. Now, OBSBOT has come out with the Tiny 2 Lite. This is a follow-up of the OBSBOT Tiny 2, but it's less expensive. And so we're going to take a look at both of these, compare them together, look at the differences, look at the similarities, and ultimately do comparison shots so you can determine which one of these tiny cameras is going to be the right webcam for you. Now, the first thing I want to do is take the Tiny 2 Lite out of the box and show you in comparison what you get when you buy a Tiny 2 Lite versus a Tiny 2. So let's take a look at both of these cameras right here. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice between the Tiny 2 Lite and the Tiny 2 is the fact that the Tiny 2's box is much bigger. And part of the reason why is because the Tiny 2 comes with a hard shell case. And this has got your camera in it, and it's got, of course, your stand and your cord, your cable, that sort of thing. And so it's a very, very nice package for the Tiny 2. The Tiny 2 Lite, though, and we're going to move this out of the way, the Tiny 2 Lite is actually a lot simpler than that, and I guess hence the Lite name is that everything's going to be a little lighter, but you open it up and you're just going to get your instructions inside the cardboard sleeve, and then you're going to get your Tiny 2 Lite, which is right here, very small still, and then you're going to get your cables down in this box right here. Now, there is no hard shell case, which I don't think is that big of a deal because how often are you going to be moving this thing around? That's my question. But it's very, very simple. It's got your cable. It's got a little adapter, so USB-C to USB-C, or you've got a USB-C to USB-A in that you can use to convert that cable. So that's it. That's all that comes in the box. Very, very simple, but everything you need. And like I said, I don't think you're really going to be traveling with this that much, so you probably aren't going to need the the traveling case, but if for some reason you do need the traveling case, that is a benefit to the Tiny 2. So what I want to do is I've got a Tiny 2 already plugged in. I want to go ahead and pull that down and compare the Tiny 2 Lite to the Tiny 2 in its physical features so that you guys can see some of the differences between the two cameras. So let me grab that really quick. Okay, so I've got both cameras plugged in, and instantly you notice a difference between the stands and maybe a few other little features. One thing that we need to do is, of course, peel off the plastic coating, and you've got a really nice clear lens on there with a pretty nice sized little webcam lens. Anyway, there's the two cameras side by side. I want to show you guys. Let's take this off the stand here, and then we'll put it back on in a minute. We'll talk about the stands and the differences in those in just a second. But if you'll notice that the base of the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite is actually a little bit taller. It's a little bit taller. Looks exactly the same other than how high it is. And you'll notice that right above the base on both of these cameras, on the OBSBOT Tiny 2, this is the Tiny 2 right here, there is a green light strip, and this is your indicator light. But on the Tiny 2 Lite right here, the indicator light is actually this little tiny tally light up there in the top right, or top left-hand corner rather, of the lens. So you get a little bit less of a indicator on the Tiny 2 Lite, but it's still there and it still works just fine. You can tell that it's green. If it's green, then that's a particular mode, and then if it's tracking, then it turns to a different color, and they've got different colors and stuff like that to determine or let you know what exactly the camera is doing. But right now they're both in green. Another thing that you're going to notice is that the actual top part of the camera here, the actual housing of the lens itself, is more of a rectangle on the OBSBOT Tiny 2, but on the Tiny 2 Lite it is a square. Now this actually just went to auto sleep right there because I haven't set it up yet. But anyway, it is a little bit bigger. You're going to notice that the Tiny 2 Lite, even though it's light, it's actually bigger than the Tiny 2. So not much bigger, but just enough to notice. Now, another thing that you're going to notice is, and this is going to be kind of harder to tell in the video, but the Tiny 2 feels more premium. And what I mean by that is there's something about the way that it's constructed. Both of them are plastic, but the plastic on the Tiny 2 is just a little bit more, I would say, like, it's less dense is a good way to put it. It's almost like it's a more fragile type plastic. Not like it's going to break, but it is definitely, you could tell that the plastic that they've used on the Tiny 2 is a little bit higher quality. Also, you'll notice on the arms here, this one has, the Tiny 2 has almost like a textured like side ring right here. And this is just kind of a flat, plastic. But it's not like a huge deal. Again, it's more about the performance of the cameras, not really about the housing. These are just things that I've noticed that I want to share with you guys. Now, one of the features that I really liked about the Tiny 2 that the Tiny 2 Lite does not have is the magnetic base. The Tiny 2 has a magnetic base, and that's actually how it attaches. And we're going to talk about the stand now. That's how it attaches to the stand. It actually magnetizes right to the stand. And so you can, pull it off very quickly and then put it back on there. And that's how it sits on your monitor. And the monitor kind of comes in like this, and then you clamp it down, and now you've got your Tiny 2 mounted. The stand on the Tiny 2 Lite is very unique. It does not have a magnet on the bottom. It does have, both of these have that little, threaded attachment for any type of like tripod or anything like that you want to use. But the Tiny 2 Lite has this really ingenious stand, which is built into the bottom of the camera itself. And so you can see that this just folds out. It's like a little door, and this just folds out, and now you attach that to your monitor, and the monitor slides in right there, which is actually really, really cool. It makes the overall profile of this camera much smaller because now your stand is built in, so you don't have two different parts. And if you need to put the stand away, you just fold it in. It's got some rubber on the bottom if you want to set it on something and not have it slide around. And then, of course, you can attach it to a tripod or something like that. The difference, though, is there's no magnet. And so I actually have used the magnet on the Tiny 2, not only for its stand, but I've got a metal shelf right up here outside of the frame. But I've got a metal shelf, and I've actually stuck the Tiny 2 to that shelf and used it as like a, to kind of like an up-close camera when I've done product shots or things like that. And so you don't have that with this. It does have the rubber on the bottom, which will stop it from sliding. The Tiny 2 also has rubber on the bottom, but not as much. It's more of a just kind of a ring. And then that magnet will hold it to anything metal. And then, of course, there's the threaded adapter right there for tripods for the Tiny 2. So some of the physical differences between the two cameras, not anything major, not anything huge, but depending on what you need this camera for. If you've got metal, shelving or, a metal desk or something, and you think that magnet would be very helpful, then maybe something like the Tiny 2 would be the way to go. Whereas, this is going to be, really expensive comparatively to the Tiny 2 Lite. If you're wanting to save some money but still get great quality, this Tiny 2 Lite may be the way to go. But I wanted to show you guys those physical differences in the lights and the stands and that sort of thing, because those are really some of the major differences between these two cameras. Once I show you guys these side-by-side comparison shots, you're going to realize that besides the physical feature differences, there's not that much of a difference between the cameras' performance themselves. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at these two cameras and the type of images that they produce. Now, here is the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite in 4K resolution. Now, one of the things you may notice, and something that I've noticed, is in 4K, it's a little bit delayed. And I actually just put the OBSBOT into track mode. So let me turn that off really quick. But the camera itself is a little delayed in 4K. The thing about it is I actually run most of my cameras, my webcams and stuff like that in 1080p 60. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to switch both cameras over to 1080p 60, which does fix the kind of delay problem. The 60 frames a second makes it feel a lot smoother, and there's not that slight delay. If you notice a slight delay, you can still run it in 4K just like I am, but you will have to probably maybe adjust the lip sync between your mic and the camera just a little bit. That is always a possibility, but it looks pretty good in 4K. You guys tell me what you think. I think it looks pretty good, minus that little bit of delay, and in 30 frames a second, it's going to have a little less smoothness to it than a 60 frame a second webcam does. But I think the image overall is great. Take a look at this image, you guys. Study this. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch both cameras into 1080p 60 frames a second, and I'm going to put them side by side. And you guys will have a chance to comment in the comments below which one you think is the Tiny 2 and which one you think is the Tiny 2 Lite after I make these adjustments. Okay, so here are both cameras, and I have switched them into 1080p at 60 frames a second. You'll notice that the images are a lot smoother and a little bit more, I don't know, they're smoother, they look nicer, but you're not going to lose a lot of the quality as far as the way the image looks between 4K and 1080p, unless you stretch the image out or you punch into it or do digital zoom or things like that. So if you're going to use the digital zoom that both of these cameras have, which is about 4 times digital zoom, running it in 4K is going to give you the best results. But Tell me right now in the comments. You guys take a minute. Comment down below. Is left, right? Which one is the Tiny 2? Which one is the Tiny 2 Lite? Get your guesses down in the comments below. Don't cheat. Don't skip ahead and check it out. And then here in just a minute, I will tell you guys. Oops, I think I just zoomed it in. We'll talk about this in just a minute. But the hand gestures, if you have them on, you got to be careful, because if you're like me and you talk with your hands and you accidentally activate one of the hand gesture features, and it could change the image on you. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But take your guesses down in the comments. Tell me which one, left side, right side, which side is which camera, and then I'll reveal it. Okay, now that you've taken your guesses in the comments, I'll go ahead and reveal it now. The left is the Tiny 2, and the right side is the Tiny 2 Lite. And so, anyway, as you can tell, these cameras are actually set at the exact same settings. So I went into the OBSBOT, remote, or the OBSBOT Center software, and I changed all of the contrast and the saturation settings, as well as the ISO, and I tried to make them look as similar as possible. But you can notice a difference in the image. Now, if I wanted to make them look exactly like each other, then I would have to change the settings to be different. And one of the things I did notice is that in the OBSBOT software, which I'll show you guys here in just a minute, I did have to increase the ISO on the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite, but there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But really, it's because the sensor on the Tiny 2 Lite is smaller, and the ISO is a different type of ISO. So I had to give it a bump of about 400. I think it was from, let me check it really quick. Yeah, so I'm running the Tiny 2 Lite at an ISO of 1400, and I'm running the Tiny 2 at an ISO of 1000. So there's about a 400, difference between the two. And also, one of the things that you'll notice is that the image on the left, or the Tiny 2's image, has a more of a natural look. I think that the Tiny 2 Lite is a little bit more saturated and a little bit more contrasty right off the rip. Now, some of this, again, has to do with the sensor size between these two cameras, and we're going to talk about that when we compare them on paper. But the sensor on the Tiny 2 is actually bigger than the sensor on the Tiny 2 Lite, so that's going to give you a little bit of a difference in how the cameras are going to look. Ultimately, though, the images both look great. You'll notice a little bit more, if you look right here, you'll notice a little bit more noise, especially with how much ISO that I've put the Tiny 2 Lite on. 1600 is going to have more noise on your background, whereas the Tiny 2 is a lot less noise, and you can really see that kind of in this wall and this door area here. But as far as like myself and the way it makes my face look, and the autofocus and stuff like that, the cameras both look really good. And now you're talking about a camera right now. I just checked the OBSBOT website, and we'll look at it here in a minute, but the Tiny 2 Lite is coming in at about $159. I think it's on sale, and normally it's about like $179, $189, somewhere in that realm, whereas the Tiny 2 is actually above $300 normally, and right now, at the time of recording this video, it's actually at $281.30, which I believe is a sale going on also. The point I'm trying to make is you're talking about a substantial difference in price between these two cameras, but not a substantial difference in quality. Minus like the noise in the background, which most people aren't really going to pay much attention to, because they're going to be looking at you, especially if you're using this for streaming. And if you adjust your lighting, like in my case, I could simply just turn up the brightness of my studio lights, and then it would compensate for my ISO, and I could bring that ISO down for the Tiny 2 Lite. And so that's another thing. I just left my lights exactly the same, and wanted to show you guys what it would take to get the Tiny 2 Lite to match the Tiny 2. So anyway, hopefully you guys have gotten a good idea about these two cameras and what all they can do side by side like this. I do want to dive into the software a little bit and just show you what that software can do. Before we jump into the software, one of the things I want to show you guys is the hand gestures and how those work. And also, another thing I wanted to mention is this entire time, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there is a slight difference in the field of view between the two cameras. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Tiny 2 Lite in 1080p 60 actually has a bigger field of view than the Tiny 2 does, but on paper, the Tiny 2 has a bigger field of view. And what I mean by that is, if you can tell, the Tiny 2's camera looks like it's more zoomed in to me, and the Tiny 2 Lite looks like it's barely zoomed out a little bit further. But on paper, the Tiny 2 has a bigger field of view, which means that you should get more area into the shot. Now, what I've noticed is, and this is a little glitch, I guess, or maybe this is the way it's supposed to operate, but the Tiny 2, when you change it to 1080p 60, it crops into the image. Instead of giving you a 1080p image, but the same field of view, it actually crops into the image, whereas the Tiny 2 Lite doesn't crop in to the image as much. And so I don't know exactly what is going on with that, but between the two cameras, the Tiny 2 Lite actually has a better field of view if you're going to be running in 1080p 60 frames a second. At 4K, you will notice the Tiny 2 has a larger field of view, which you saw at the beginning of the video when I showed you the Tiny 2 Lite, and the Tiny 2 is the same way. It's got a bigger field of view when you are in full 4K. So both cameras do have tracking capabilities. So one thing you can do is put up the L sign, and both cameras will zoom into your face. And if you do the L sign again, both cameras will zoom out. Works perfect. Awesome. Another thing you can do, and this is one of the coolest things about these cameras because they are PTZ cameras, you can hold your hand up and both cameras will go into tracking mode. And now when I walk around my room, both cameras will follow me. And what's crazy about it is both cameras did a great job. You could see how well they did together. And if I hold my hand up again, it's going to stop the tracking. And so now they're going to be stationary. And if I was to move, they're not going to follow me around anymore. Now, the Tiny 2 does have something that the Tiny 2 Lite does not have, which is voice activated commands. I don't have those turned on, and I won't demo them in this video, but I did demo them in the video I did on the Tiny 2 if you want to check that out. But that is something that you don't get with the Tiny 2 Lite. I will tell you, however, if you're going to be talking in front of this camera at all, I actually find those to be quite annoying, because if you say anything that makes the camera think that you are voice activating something, then the camera may change positions on you or do something that you don't want it to do. So I actually recommend turning those commands, those vocal commands, off. It's not, I mean, it's a cool feature in theory, but in practicality, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense. The other thing that I like to do is actually turn off the hand motions. Now, these can be useful if you're not going to be at a desk with a stream deck or something like that. Let's say you're in a classroom. Having the hand motions where you can control the camera and tell it what to do could be really, really helpful. But for me, as a streamer and somebody that creates content at my desk, I use my hands a lot when I'm talking, as you guys can probably tell, and I'm really trying hard not to do that too much in the camera, because a lot of times I'll end up activating one of the zoom feature or the tracking or something like that, and have the camera start doing something I don't want it to do. So I actually turn off all of those features, but they both are very similar in those regards. They both have the hand tracking, or the hand gestures rather, for tracking and that sort of thing. One last thing I wanted to show you guys was the comparison of the autofocuses between these two cameras. And so I've got a little handheld Tetris game that is rechargeable. It's actually a cool little Tetris game here. And I'm going to use this as my product that I show off to see what the focus is like. And right away, you can tell that the Tiny 2 Lite is having a little bit of a difficulty here, but let me try it again here. I'm going to hold it up, and we'll see which one focuses the fastest and how those focuses look. Now, if it you can see it's kind of hunting around a little bit. If it sees my face, then obviously it's going to try to focus on my face, or it's going to get a little confused. So if you hold it up in front of your face, both are pretty good. It's kind of hard to cover my face up with both of them at the same time. Let me turn this little game over and show you the back. So one thing I'm noticing is if I hold this out to the side, the Tiny 2 Lite has a little bit of a problem figuring out where the focus is supposed to be. But if I go into the center of the frame, then it does catch it and it focuses on it. But see how it's doing a little focus hunting. This could be because my lighting is set for the Tiny 2 rather than the Lite, more, ideally. But the focus is good. It is tack sharp once it hits it, but you've really got to put it in the center of the frame. There we go. See, there's the focus right there. So it does get it. You got to put it right in the center of the camera. And I think that has to do with that difference in the autofocus, what they call it. Let me look really quick. PDAF focus on the Tiny 2 Lite versus On the Tiny 2, you've got the all pixel autofocus, and so the autofocus is better on the Tiny 2. That is just, there's no doubt about it. The autofocus is incredible. You can still see that the Tiny 2 Lite is having a little bit of trouble with the close-ups. It gets it, but it'll focus. See how it's like focus hunting a little bit here and there? See that? Whereas the Tiny 2 is locked in. So I'll tell you right now, like, this test alone, if I'm trying to get the best possible camera and I've got the money, I'm still gonna go Tiny 2. Because one of the things that I use these cameras for is to show things off, you know, products and that sort of thing. And the focus is just way too good on the Tiny 2. And it does hit on the Tiny 2 Lite, and it has tack sharp focus as long as it can grab the focus and then you don't move around too much. But because you get that all pixel focus on the original Tiny 2, it just does better. It does better. And so, you know, this is one of those things where between the two, I gotta say that the focus up close is better on the original Tiny 2. But I'm gonna go ahead and dive in, and I want to show you guys the OBSBOT Center software, and then we'll talk about more of the features that the Tiny 2 Lite has, which the Tiny 2 has all the same features and then some. We're going to talk about those differences as well here in just a minute, but I want to show you guys the software and how powerful it is, because you can really set up the Tiny 2 Lite however you'd like it. Now, as you can see on the left side of the screen, I've got the OBSBOT Center software, and if you're on the latest version of this, they've actually done some really cool upgrades to it, but I wanted to show you guys they've got all the tracking stuff that we just went over, as well as you can also set things like, for instance, if you want it to be in close-up mode, if I turn that on and I turn on normal tracking, or I turn on just close-up rather, if I get up, it's going to actually keep zoomed in on me as I move around. So not just move around with me, but it'll zoom in closer to me automatically. And you can see it goes right back out to full field of view once I'm sitting close enough to the camera. But close-up is a really cool one if you're going to be moving around in a room. It kind of gives you that feeling of actually having a real cameraman there filming or doing the video work. We're going to turn that off, though. You've also got motion, like if you're going to be moving around really fast, you can use the motion setting. And of course, upper body will just keep your upper body in the frame. There's also this really cool AI mode called Group. And basically, you turn this on and it will keep everybody that's in front of the camera kind of in frame rather than selecting one person, which could be really helpful depending on what all you're using this camera for. But that's a very nice touch. I really like that. There's also presets. So for instance, I can move my camera around, and let's say that I get my camera in the perfect position here. There, okay, so I get my camera in the perfect position. I can hit preset 1 and say update PTZ. And now the camera is going to remember this is exactly where I want it to go if I hit preset 1. Whereas I can also do another preset. Let's say I go over here and look at my shelf, and I can say update PTZ here, and now preset 2 is going to be this position. So if I go to preset 1 and I click on that, it's back to me. Then if I want to show my shelf over there, I can hit preset 2, and now it's back over there. I don't understand why it just went into black and white mode, though. Oh, okay. I just realized why that is. So you can actually set within each of these modes, and this is actually a newer feature that they've added since, and I just updated these right before this video. But there's actually a way where if you go into the preset, you can go to more settings, and you can actually set per preset. You can set your like contrast, saturation, sharpness, hue, and that sort of thing. So for instance, if I want to have, you know, one preset be with, you know, full color, and then one be black and white, or one be, you know, overexposed, and then one be normal, or whatever, you can set all of this stuff up to also be a part of the preset, which is actually pretty cool if you think about it. I didn't know that that was an option, or I didn't know that they had added that rather. But that's really, really, really cool. So in this case, if I go over to image and I just adjust the contrast back up to normal, then at that point, you know, I can set the camera as a whole. But then for my presets, I'm going to want to go in and actually set those. And they probably need to have the presets attached to this, because having to set the preset settings for every single preset would actually be annoying. So that's something they'll have to bring in a future update. But that's cool to know that you can actually have, you know, color adjustments and stuff saved to your presets as well. Then underneath the presets, you've got your view and gimbal, which is basically you drag this around and this moves your camera. And you can just hold it in whatever angle you want, and that's where the camera is going to be. Now, I will tell you, you also have the option to have Stream Deck support. It's not currently available, but it should be coming very soon. Next, we'll come over to image, and under image, you basically can adjust all the things like your focus, your exposure, your white balance, and your image settings like we did earlier with the contrast, the saturation, and the hue and the sharpness and that sort of thing. Next to that, we'll go to more, and here is where you're going to adjust like your sleep timer, your gesture controls, which you know, you can turn on and off right here, and like what the zoom factor is going to be whenever you hold up the zoom sign and that sort of thing, as well as your audio settings if you want to use the onboard microphones on these cameras. You can even mirror the image, and you've got a couple other things like view and gimbal reversed and indicator status light, as well as the brightness of that light, which is that little tally light on the front of the OBSBOT you know, Tiny 2 Lite, or the strip on the Tiny 2. And then of course it tells you your firmware version, which you can update your firmware here if there's a new update, as well as you know, logs and manual upgrade and factory reset and all that kind of stuff. So pretty cool. The other thing that they've done is if you've got two cameras like I do, I've got a Tiny 2 and a Tiny 2 Lite, then you can actually switch between the cameras just by pressing the 1 or the 2, and as you hover over, it'll tell you which one you're on. Right now I'm on the Tiny 2. I can switch over to the Tiny 2 Lite right there, and you can control multiple OBSBOT cameras just by clicking through, up to what looks like 4 up here at the top, which is really, really cool. You can have up to 4 of these guys and get all the angles that you could possibly want. So there's the software for the OBSBOT Tiny 2. Now let's talk about the differences on paper between the Tiny 2 Lite and the Tiny 2 itself. All right, now on the OBSBOT website itself, I've got the Tiny 2 Lite, the Tiny 2, and the Tiny 4K just for reference here. But one of the things that I want to mention to you guys is basically I want you to look at these prices. Now these actually just came down recently, but right now at the time of recording this video, and I'm gonna have links to these, by the way, down in the description. So if you want to pick up any of these cameras, or you want to take advantage of this sale that's going on, make sure that you hit those links down in the description to not only support this channel, because I am an affiliate with them, but also to get yourself you know, in on these deals here. But anyway, $159 right now for the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite, which is incredible. For a webcam, this is actually cheaper, and even at full price, this is cheaper than like things like the Logitech Brio or cameras like that came out a long time ago, and they'll have nowhere near the features, and honestly don't look as good in my opinion. I use the Brio, I like the Brio, but if I'm comparing it to the Tiny 2, I like the Tiny 2 better, or the Tiny 2 Lite. And so anyway, you do see a big price difference though, of over $100. There's a big price difference between the Tiny 2 and the Tiny 2 Lite. So the first major difference that you're going to notice between these cameras is the sensor sizes, okay? The sensor sizes are all different. The Tiny 2 does have a larger sensor than the Tiny 2 Lite. And so, you know, that's something to consider. That's going to be part of the reason why the Tiny 2 has less of the noise, and you can run lower ISO, as well as just a little bit better of a picture. And then underneath that, they're all 4K at 30 frames a second or 1080p 60. So that's the same. All have 4x digital zoom. Field of view is going to be another difference. The Tiny 2 and the Tiny 4K have almost the exact same field of view at 86 or 85.5, whereas the Lite is at 79.4. But as we talked about, whenever you put it into 1080p 60, which is how most people are probably going to use this camera, it does crop in. It crops in, and so once it crops in, the Tiny 2 Lite actually has a better field of view, at least with the models that I have, the two devices that I have. So something to consider there. If you're going to be running it in 4K and it's going to be your only camera, for me, I've got so many cameras plugged in that I can't run it 4K efficiently, but if you're going to be running it at 4K, then you will get a slightly better field of view out of the Tiny 2. You'll notice that the autofocus is different on the Tiny 2 Lite versus the Tiny 2, and the Tiny 2 has a slightly different, you know, all pixel autofocus, and so the autofocus is a little bit better on the Tiny 2 from what I've noticed. Also, HDR is going to be a little bit different. They've got Pixgain HDR on the Tiny 2, and the Lite has just regular old HDR, so going to be, again, a little bit of a difference, but I don't even turn on HDR, so it doesn't really matter that much. Your ISO, this is another one of the bigger differences. Dual native ISO versus single native, not a huge difference, but we did notice that the ISO performance on the Tiny 2 was better. And then of course your USB connections. The Tiny 2 Lite has a 2.0 USB connection versus a 3.0, which is 10 times faster on the Tiny 2. So if you want, you know, the fastest connection possible, your 3.0 connection on the Tiny 2 is going to be the way to go. But 2.0 on the Tiny 2 Lite, as you guys saw, they're both responsive. They both were working fine. Not that big of a deal, to be honest. Let's see. They all have a dedicated remote controller that you can use. You can also use the software. Audio inputs are a little bit different. They're the same between the Tiny 2 and the Tiny 2 Lite. The only one that's a little different is the Tiny 4K, but we're not even really worried about that one. And then shooting modes, everything is the same except for on the Tiny 2 Lite, you don't get the downward shooting mode. But honestly, not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal at all. Tiny 2, you do get the downward shooting mode. And so one of the reasons why that is because on the original Tiny 2, the stand allows you to pull the camera forward. And I just put it into tracking mode. So let me turn that off really quick. Again, hand gestures, I would keep those off. But it allows you to tilt the camera forward. And so you can have a top-down shot from the top of your monitor using the stand that comes with the camera. With the Tiny 2 Lite, because the stand's built in, you cannot tilt it forward and have that top-down shot in that way. And so that's something that you are lacking on the Tiny 2, unless you mount it with a different mount of some sort, you know, some type of mounting arm or something where you can point it straight down, and then it's going to work just fine, but it doesn't come out of the box that way. And then, of course, AI features, it's going to be pretty much the same. The only things that are lacking is the Tiny 2 Lite does not have the headless and lower body focus or tracking, body part tracking, whereas the Tiny 2 does. It's got the headless and lower body. Not a huge deal for the majority of people. And then hand tracking, Tiny 2 Lite does not have hand tracking, whereas the Tiny 2 does. But that's something, again, that I have never actually used. It could be good if you're trying to show a product off or something and you want it to always be in the shot. But again, going to be a more nuanced, you know, use case. Zone tracking is basically where, and this is, again, something that the Tiny 2 Lite does not have. But it's where there'll be a specific zone that you can set. And as long as you're in that zone, it won't follow you. But the moment you move out of the zone, it will go into tracking mode, it'll track you, and then when you come back into the zone, it will get back into position perfectly. This actually is pretty cool, and this is one reason why you might want the Tiny 2 over the Lite, because you know, I could see a streamer setting this up to have a zone in their streaming area, but then if they get up, they want the camera to automatically follow them. And that's a really cool feature that I think that the Tiny 2 does have a leg up on the Lite. But you got to ask yourself again, you know, is it that big of a deal, or could you just put your hand up and have it track you anytime you're going to leave, and then when you sit back down, you put your hand up again and it stops tracking you? So there's a way around it, but that is another difference. Zone tracking is, you know, could be cool, but not a deal breaker in my opinion. The Tiny 2 does not have preset modes, but the Tiny 2 Lite does, and this is what we were looking at earlier, where you could change per preset. You could change like the color and the saturation, the contrast, that sort of thing. And save it to each individual preset. Now, again, they're going to have to make it to where when you save a preset, it saves whatever the current global settings are. But that is a huge feature. I would actually love to see that on the Tiny 2 itself, and that's something the Tiny 2 will not have. So the Lite does have a leg up over the Tiny 2 in that regard. And then desk mode and whiteboard mode, these are like where the Tiny 2 can focus either on your desk and try to give it the you know, look of a top-down shot, even though it's stretching the image and manipulating it a little bit. And then whiteboard is where it will actually focus on a whiteboard and kind of zoom up on it whenever you are in that mode. If you're a teacher, that's a really good one, because then you can set, you know, whiteboard mode to be on, and it will focus on the whiteboard as you are going through a lesson or something. But again, depending on how you're using it, might not be that big of a deal. I've never actually used this feature myself, so not a huge deal breaker either. They both have gesture controls, voice controls, not available on the Lite like we mentioned. Tiny 2 does have them, but I would keep them off. And then they both have sleep mode and that sort of thing. So those are your major differences between the two cameras. Other than that, I really think that the Tiny 2 Lite, as far as how much it costs, the value proposition, I think the Lite is a great option. If you don't have the budget to go with the original Tiny 2, which is my ultimate recommendation, I still think it is the best webcam on the market today. If you can't get the Tiny 2, then my next recommendation would be to look at getting something like the Lite, because it does a great job. It's got all the same features. It is a PTZ camera, so it moves around. You can have these presets and all these cool options that a lot of webcams just can't give you. So again, it depends on your needs, but at that $159 price point on sale right now, and then I think it's like $179 or $189 normally, it's still a great value proposition for a webcam, even if it, you know, lacks in the all pixel autofocus and some of those things. So Anyway, there's a comparison between the Tiny 2 Lite and the Tiny 2. Check out the links in the description of this video if you want to buy the Tiny 2 or the Tiny 2 Lite. I've got both of those linked down there, and those links do support this YouTube channel and support me, not at any additional cost to you, but it just tells OBSBOT that I sent you guys over there. Also, if you got any questions about these cameras, feel free to leave a comment down in the description of the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, ring the notification bell if you want to know when videos like this go live. You can also find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/EagleGarrett. I'm live over there all the time, so you can come hang out with me in person and ask questions there also, or just hang out with us and watch us play some games. We've also got a great Discord community, which I'll have a link for down in the description, as well as links for all of my social media platforms, so you can join me on any of those to follow my journey. With that being said, you guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Until the next one, rock on, peace out, God bless, and last but not least, with Superman, he would show up and he was just kind of invincible, and like, if he showed up, you knew it was over as a bad guy, right? But you also knew you could get kryptonite bullets or whatever, and you could still possibly win. With Batman, it was like you didn't know when he was going to show up, where he was going to show up, or like what was going to happen, right? Superman would just like fly in, like, here I am, boys. You know what I mean? Like, he didn't try to be stealthy about it because he didn't need to be usually. Batman was like, I'm going to, like, you'll be walking down a dark alley and then suddenly you'll just see my eyes open and he's hanging upside down from like a fire escape. You know what I mean? Classic Batman, dude. Classic Batman.